My name is Jacek Bylica, by the way. I am the EU's special envoy for non-proliferation and disarmament issues, and one of the sort of silent co-organizers of this event. We have with us Professor Han Hua from the Center for Arms Control and Disarmament at the School of International Studies of the Beijing University in China. She will be followed in her presentation by Mr. Ian Stewart from King's College London, and I hate to say this, Department of War Studies. I mean, in most places those are called defense studies or security, but you have to be sort of very traditional over there. Let's hope you will not, your conclusion will not be that, we are having a war situation here. And then Mr. Bernt Berger, who is a senior research fellow and the head of Asia program at the Institute of Security and Development Policy in Stockholm, but who is himself German. By way of introduction, I think I should refer to what you already heard at the beginning at the plenary session from the High Representative Mogherini and from our political director Helga Schmidt about the importance of multilateral solutions and effective multilateralism in the European Union's approach to non-proliferation and disarmament, and some experience from the Iranian negotiations, which was discussed by the architect, actually, of this deal, Helga Maria Schmidt. And the major question which we have in the title of this panel is to what extent there can be lessons drawn, positive or negative, or what comparisons can be made between the situations of the Iranian nuclear program and the North Korean nuclear program. I suspect I know where it is heading in terms of optimism or pessimism, but maybe we will get some interesting insights during this discussion. And after the initial comments, which will be no more than 7-8 minutes each, hopefully, I would suggest that we have a discussion with the audience and more than Q&A, maybe even contributions from the floor. With this, let me give the floor to Professor Han Hua.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Han Hua from Peking University, so my view is more from academic person. I would like to hear from you your feedback and looking for your comments and questions. Basically, I'm going to talk about 4 aspects. The first one is about the Chinese interest in non-proliferation. And second one is about Chinese WMD non-proliferation diplomacy and practice. And the third part, I'm going to talk about some challenges in which China is facing. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how to cope with these challenges. So let me start with Chinese interest in non-proliferation. It seems to me since 1990s, China has dramatically changed its view and non-proliferation policy as it has increasingly recognized the WMD-related proliferation is against his national interest. Because we talk about the 2 WMD threats that China, as well as the world, is facing. For China, more nuclear states are more emerging in Asia in general and on China's border in particular. And your nuclear terrorism and as a result of the nuclear security challenges is also something China has to face in recent years. So what I want to say is that non-proliferation is Chinese interest. Chinese non-proliferation policy is also sincere, not for some trade-off with other countries for other purpose, but is really in deep in the national security interest. What China has done from diplomatic and also in the implementation practice. First of all, I want to say the regime's participation has been increasingly recognized in the world. Let me start with the NPT and NSG. Especially NSG, China has already shown his willingness to follow the list of the group. But unfortunately, so far, China is not the member of MTCR, but China has already shown his following of the guidelines in terms of the 2002 guidelines of MTCR. In diplomatic front, China is a proactive player in the key nuclear issues. Six-party talks, for example, even is now is not in the active way, as many people already noticed that. But China is the key player, if I'm not using the leading player, to tackle the proliferation or the nuclear program in North Korea. But China has done, as many people have already recognized, to prevent the even further nuclearization in the Korean Peninsula. And China is also engaged in the negotiation in terms of nuclear deal, Iran nuclear deal. And also when we talk about chemical weapons verification and abolition in Syria, China is also participant proactively. And China is also rearranged his approach and implementation on the export control in domestic arena. First of all, I would like to say a law-based system has already settled down rather than the administrative approach like in the past. And also China institutionalized of the export control system, especially when we talk leadership and the coordination among the sectors and among the authorities. The Ministry of Commerce Export Control Bureau has played a coordinative role to prevent or counter illicit activities in China. And NGOs also play a role in the training course among the Chinese enterprises and including some private enterprises. But I have to admit, in recent years, some new challenges China has facing. To be frank, China is a huge country with roughly 1.4 billion population and has gone significant economic and social transformation as a whole. And any policy and his implementation has to tackle enormous challenges in the society. Non-proliferation policy is no exception. The circumstances that China is implementing non-proliferation policy is very different from what it was in 1990s. First of all, in terms of goods, when we talk about the risk, we talk about more now about dual-use items and items or more components rather than the whole body of the items. And some of the items are not included in the trigger list or any kinds of list of control. So that gave some great room for the illegal transfers. Secondly, when we talk about entities, now we faced not the state-owned enterprises, the big corporations, but rather the private companies and even individuals. They are players engaged in illicit activities. Certainly, the way or the approach they do business is not a traditional way, which usually sell or transfer items from within China, but through their connection networks with corporations outside the country, sometimes in the United States or other Western countries. And that all put them together, we feel is, again, they are facing the challenges. How to meet the challenges? I think for the Chinese approach, the long-preferred approach to tackle the non-proliferation issue is rather than the diplomatic engagement and the low-profile, nuclear diplomacy. Nuclear coalition and the military actions are counterproductive in the efforts to prevent or counter-proliferation for the Chinese perspective. China values the NPT regime, even though it has been in crisis. Within the regime, China is ready to cooperate with other countries, including EU, to enhance compliance and the enforcement of non-proliferation policy. We know some negotiations or dialogue between China and EU when we talk about WMD clause or other issues like ratification of CDBT. China is still excluded in some major multilateral regimes, such as MTCR, as I mentioned before. Making the regime more inclusive is crucial for China to engage in a cooperative way when we talk about the cooperation or the policy implementation or the enforcement. And lastly, China is emerging energy suppliers of nuclear energy and technology, and China's interest in the market is needed to be considered, not really, rejected. But from the China's perspective, I think China should also balance between his commercial interests and non-proliferation risk. That's what I want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for outlining the evolution of the China's non-proliferation policy, how China came to the conclusion that proliferation is actually against national interest and security. And thank you also for being honest about the problems with the implementation, especially of export control laws and regulations. There is some tradition with this in China. Even in imperial times, there was a saying, I think, that the sky is high, but the emperor is far away. So it was always a challenge, I think, to deal with the implementation. But this is, I think, a good overall introduction to the topic we are discussing. And now I would like to move to Mr. Ian Stewart. You have the floor.
Thank you and good afternoon. Actually, I think my remarks fit very well with the remarks of the previous speaker. To summarise my remarks and my argument, my view is that China is the single biggest source problem in terms of non-proliferation at present, and that there's scope and a need to engage China in terms of improving the implementation of export controls. Coming back to the theme of this event and the idea of multilateralism, I would actually make an argument, and I'll come on to make this argument, that the EU is perhaps uniquely placed to work with China on these issues, perhaps more so than the US, and I want to come on to develop that a little bit further. But before doing so, let me take a second to set the scene. So I run Project Alpha at King's College London. I'm in the War Studies department, but war is not my thing, so to speak. So what I do is work on export controls. I track illicit trade, and at King's we try to follow every procurement for Iran's nuclear program, missile program, and so on. And we also look at who it is in the world that makes all of the dual-use items on the NSG dual-use lists. And I mention this because on both fronts, China is central and key. For the data set of some 300 cases of Iranian nuclear-related procurement, a very high percentage have either come from or passed through China. When it comes to the production of dual-use goods, and I'll talk more about this in a second, we see a very rapid expansion in terms of production of controlled dual-use goods, in part because of China's 5-year investment plans. So I'm going to talk through these issues as I go through my remarks, but that's the scene that I want to set as I start these remarks. So my argument is that China is the biggest source problem. That's not to say that they don't have export controls in place and that they haven't been trying to enforce them. I'll come on to describe some recent developments on that front that mean that China, in fact, is I think, rapidly improving its implementation of export controls. But in terms of the source problem that I speak of, so if you were to look at China's last 5-year plan for industrial development from 2011, you see there that many of the technologies that are being prioritised are in fact the items on the control lists. And that covers everything from alloys through to machine tools and so on and so on. We can also take this out of the abstract to some extent and talk about specific examples. So there's a few very famous or infamous case studies, one involving MKS Shanghai Limited, who was a reseller of a US product, a pressure transducer. And if you see photographs of Iran's nuclear program, you see thousands of these things, one per centrifuge. And the question is, how did these American-made products get to Iran? And the answer is through the Chinese subsidiary of the MKS company. We could also talk about cases such as Carol Li Fangwei, the now infamous serial proliferator who has been involved in selling missile-related technologies to Iran for the period of a decade or more, in fact, and who is kind of the key litmus test when it comes to the US and their gauge of how far Chinese implementation of non-proliferation controls has progressed. And the reason for that is that there's been little information, evidence of enforcement actions taken against Carol Li, and it's often the case that people go back to. I wouldn't necessarily focus on the Carol Li test as the ultimate test of the overall Chinese system, but it is relevant. In terms of the source problem, I'm going to focus on dual-use goods, which I think is the most important aspect. Others, though, would also talk about grandfathering and the supply of nuclear reactors to Pakistan. I'm more relaxed about that than some, I think, because I think it is subject to IAEA safeguards and so on and so on. And I do see a need to engage countries that are currently outside of the regime in the regime in some way. And we did so with India, and at some point we need to think about Pakistan too. And there's an interesting set of relations there. I won't talk to that, but maybe it's something we can come back to in the discussion. So then there is a definite move towards manufacture of dual-use goods that I've alluded to in these strategic 5-year plans. What I would say, though, is from the work that we've done looking at each of these specific technologies and the actual producers of them in China, they're not there yet. So for carbon fibre, for example, which is made by commercially around 9 companies worldwide in terms of the stuff that we actually care about from a non-proliferation perspective, at present there are 20 or more companies operating in China trying to produce this material, and none of which are succeeding in producing anything more than batch quantities of the lower grade materials. So a definite intent to indigenise, but they're not yet there. Of course they will get there at some point, and that's the key question. So for now, the issue is one of diversion. It's one of diversion of Western-made goods which are transiting through China, perhaps through the subsidiaries like MKS Shanghai Limited that I mentioned, or so on. And that's a challenging issue that I think is the foremost problem that we have to deal with immediately. But I don't want to lose this focus on the coming hurdle of Chinese production of vast quantities of dual-use goods. So, moving forward, I won't reflect on the gradual development of China's non-proliferation commitments, and I largely share a view with my fellow panellists that things have moved gradually over a number of decades to the point at which we find ourselves now. What I would reflect on instead, perhaps, is that in 2014 and going forward, I think, more rapid progress. And in particular, the new bureau that was established in the Ministry of Commerce, I think, is an important step for a number of reasons. So the bureau has, as part of its mandate, an enforcement division. So they'll be actively looking for violations of controls, looking into violations. And that should provide the mechanism through which Western partners can raise concerns with Chinese officials and also get feedback, because one of the big challenges we have at present is that intelligence is shared and it kind of disappears into the Chinese system without any follow-up action. This new bureau is also taking a kind of a review, a stock take of the very complex Chinese law in this area, and it is very, very complex. I understand that an outcome of this, it is hoped, will be by 2020 the adoption of a new export control law, a criminal law, and that's important in the Chinese context. So there's positive signs there too. And finally, I understand that last year there was also a court judgment or decision that allows export control violations to be treated as criminal matters. So those are 3 individual and distinct activities, but kind of in my mind point to a positive trend. Why, or what's the broader purpose here? I think that China is seeing strategic trade controls, export controls, as strategic trade management issues. They want to be seen to be holding technologies responsibly, but at the same time they want to be coming to the EU and to the US and encouraging the trade in these items. And in fact, we see this in practice. There is an EU-China high technology working group. There is a US-China high technology working group. And I think it's quite clear in my mind that the two issues are not unrelated. But there is more work to be done. China is a vast country, and the number of individuals who could become involved as these brokers, distributors, middlemen in these transactions is vast. I love the phrase, the one that you alluded to. So Beijing is powerful, but the emperor is far away, and that speaks very well of the Chinese system, in fact. And so, on this basis, I do think there's a need for more investment by China in export controls. But more importantly, I think for this forum, for this question, I think there's a need for more cooperation with China to build capacity, to share experiences, to help draft laws if that's what's necessary, and so on and so on. The EU has been engaged on these issues for a number of years, of course, and I have now some role in that. But in my mind, this kind of cooperation is very central and very key. I want to just take a very quick detour to talk about the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, because I think there's an important point here, and I spend a lot of time pondering this issue of regime membership, regime engagement. So China has had an application to the MTCR tabled since 2002. A couple of weeks ago in Rotterdam, the Indian application was considered, and by all signs, it's likely that India will be accepted into the MTCR at some point in the next year. There's a bilateral dispute with Italy that's currently stalling matters, but once that's overcome, we could well find ourselves in the position where India is accepted whilst China's membership of the MTCR continues to be tabled. The reason I raise that is, so right now my sense is there is scope to engage China on these issues, and there's a willingness in China taking the right steps. What I don't want is for something like the issue of MTCR non-membership, of accepting rival in India into one of the regimes to set back China's momentum in this area. So to go back to my main remarks, so I've suggested that there's a need for cooperation, and I suggested in my opening argument that there was a potential that that the EU is better placed here to lead than perhaps the US. And let me reflect upon that. So there is a long-standing cooperation between the EU and China. When I look at the relationships between the US and China on this issue, I see that those relations often get bogged down by other unrelated issues, or perhaps even by related issues. And when you have that kind of dynamic, it seems to me that the EU could well placed to lead this effort. That does raise the question of, does that mean that the EU could be working with China even if the US isn't? And if we ponder the question of what is the track, the direction of US-China relations, I'm not quite sure that it's positive overall in the grand scheme of things. So we could find ourselves in a position where the EU can, and I think should, be continuing to engage China even if the US isn't. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these remarks and pointing out to some problems. I mean, if China is increasingly the factory of the world, there is it's not surprise that also dual-use goods are manufactured just because of the sheer size. Obviously, diversion is another issue, but thank you for pinpointing that there is a positive trend in improved implementation of export control commitments by China. And thank you for mentioning the EU cooperation with China, which actually is happening in export control, and we have some common capacity building, experience sharing events. And by way of MTCR, just to sort of water your appetite for the future discussion, let me point out that we have in the very distinguished audience also a former chairman of the MTCR, Ambassador Carlo Trezza of Italy. So now we would be moving probably to the more pointed question in the title of this panel, which is Iran versus North Korea. Are there the two cases similar? Can there be optimism drawn from the resolution of the Iranian nuclear issue for the North Korean case? And with this, I'm turning the floor to Bernt Berger. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Yes, I want to concentrate on the second part of this title, and I'm not so much looking at the verses, but from to. And I have to say from the beginning that I don't think that's very realistic. Now, when someone's dealing with North Korea, you have to have this professional optimism, what all of you deal with, but I think we should stay first with the things what we already dealt with. And I think it's very positive that the EU and China and the P5+1 format were able to cooperate, which I think is a precedent to international security cooperation. But I think there are 4 or 5 reasons why this should not move on to North Korea, but we should stay with the construction site that we already have. And that first reason is that very Chinese perspective. I think China's policy towards Middle East is as such that it still tries to stay a neutral actor. It has become engaged in Iran for its own interests, that the stability in the Middle East, and trying to maintain the energy relations, etc., etc. But through the deal and the commitments that China has and the new possibilities it has in terms of building new nuclear reactors, of course, there are other actors in the Middle East have a problem and want the same thing, speaking of Saudi Arabia and then in the follow-up perhaps the Emirates. So China will have to deal with different needs and interests in the Middle East, and it will not get out of the story. So the main interest there is getting other parties to the table and deal with the regional issues rather than moving them to Asia and open another construction site. Speaking of North Korea, China's policy, is different, of course, because it's the immediate neighborhood. China has changed its policy towards North Korea under Xi Jinping and has adopted a much more tougher stance, I would say. The first time I ever heard the word sticks and carrots in policy in China, meaning that the denuclearization issue is very important for China nowadays, and has made it very clear to North Korea that this is something that China will not negotiate about. Now, at the same time, China has not changed its policy completely. It stays pragmatic and has still the same interests, being stability on the peninsula and trying to open the markets and invest there. It has used the carrot and stick insofar that the relation with South Korea were strengthened and they were put on display on numerous occasions. It is engaging more now again in regional affairs with Japan and Japan and Korea, and of course it has always been focusing on reviving the six-party talks and solving problems at the negotiation table. So overall, the approach is more determined but still pragmatic. Second reason why it's not a good idea, or even the two cases of Iran and North Korea are not comparable, is because of the situation on the Korean Peninsula. We still deal with a ceasefire area, which is taken very serious by the North Korean side. North Koreans, often when you talk with them, still consider themselves in a state of war, which is, of course, has strong implications for how they go to the negotiation table and what they're willing to deal with. And since negotiations so far in the six-party talks had a very biased focus only on denuclearization rather than having a more comprehensive approach towards the real needs that are there on all sides, that could be defined in a roadmap with a lot of different processes involving a peace process. And I think that's what's happening at the moment. The North Koreans put a peace treaty onto the agenda, which we can interpret as blocking any process in the future. I think that's an essential need for them to move on, and more important than small steps in trust building. Now, of course, a peace treaty will not stand in the beginning of a process, will stand in the end of a process, and this process has to be road mapped and be simultaneous to denuclearization steps, etc. The third reason why I don't think Iran and North Korea compares are domestic politics. Iran is, I think, a much more sophisticated political system than what we see in North Korea. Iran has internal mechanisms for consensus building, and power struggles can be dealt with nowadays, although, of course, there's still problems there, but they were able to find consensus. In North Korea, the nuclear issue is a matter of the status quo, even internally. That means in the struggle between the party, the military, and Kim Jong-un in the middle, he needs this program for his policies, which are obviously having a shift away from military-first policy, which is, of course, not completely happening now, but to shift away to more an economic domestic focus, and the nuclear deterrent is important in order to perhaps weaken the military, although he, of course, will always have to swing back and forth in that process. So he basically, for domestic reasons, cannot shift away from the nuclear program. On EU cooperation on the Korean Peninsula, I think I'm very skeptical there. I think the EU could theoretically play a constructive role by supporting the process and contributing to develop a roadmap and the design of a process. But the EU has not been part of the six-party talks. It has lost out on a lot of developments that have been there, and it's very questionable of the players who are there, particularly China, want to have EU at the table or even give away parts of the process to the EU. That's something perhaps which you can answer. So overall, I think, no, it's not a move from Iran to North Korea now, and I think North Korea is far more complex than what we have been dealing with in Iran, and it needs a complete rethink there, what kind of processes we need to synchronize there, how we sequence them, and I think, well, the 6 parties have a big task there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Even though you have ended on a rather somber note, I must admit. Obviously, for the sake of discussion, it could be possible to maybe try to turn things around a little bit and say, for example, and claim that, for example, in autocratic regimes, once a decision or to major policy decision is taken at the top, it's much easier to implement. I mean, witness, for example, a case study of ratification of arms control agreements in the Soviet Union and in the United States. I mean, obviously, a democratic political system, sometimes it is actually much more difficult to make concessions or to make hard policy choices. But it's just for the sake of discussion. Overall, I think this is an analysis which is very important to take into account while discussing this question. And let me say that EU remains actually engaged with North Korea, even though we call it a critical dialogue between the EU and DPRK. I would like now to open the question the floor to questions, but even more to comments from the floor. And we have microphone in the room on that hand side, whoever would like, and we have already a first question over there in the last row, to be followed here in the first row.
Thank you very much. Alan Ware from Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. I have a question for Mr. Berger and a question for Professor Huahan. For Mr. Berger, I understand that it seems very difficult to expect North Korea to unilaterally denuclearize. But what about the proposal, which now has cross-party support in the South Korean and the Japanese parliaments, for a Northeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone along the 3+3 model, which would mean the reduction of the role of nuclear weapons by the 3 key countries in the region, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan, plus also security assurances from the other 3. And my question for Professor Huahan is with regards to cooperation and non-proliferation. It's very difficult when there are tensions between the major powers in a region. And we see tensions at the moment between China and some of the other neighbours over some of the territories in the China Sea. Norway and Russia managed to resolve a similar type of dispute up in the Arctic Ocean and the continental shelf through the Law of the Sea Tribunal. And I know that Philippines has requested the Law of Sea Tribunal and the Permanent Court of Arbitration to assist with resolving the conflict with China. Is this something that China would welcome as a way of resolving or dealing with some of those tensions and helping to rebuild cooperation between the major powers on non-proliferation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. In keeping with the spirit of discussion rather than bilateral Q&As, I would suggest we collect a number of questions and comments with your permission, and then move to the panel. Ambassador Treza in the front row.
Thank you very much. I have a remark first of all, and that is that I have no difficulties to recognize that China has an interest to strengthen non-proliferation, because basically China is a beneficiary of non-proliferation, especially in the nuclear field, where her nuclear status is recognized. So, but in spite of that, China has not ratified the CTBT. Now, we know the difficulties that the Americans have in ratifying the CTBT for domestic reasons. I think China has not the same difficulties with domestically. So I think it would be expected for China as a growing and emerging world leader to exercise this role of leadership by not waiting for the United States to ratify, but be the one who makes the first step. As far as non-proliferation regimes are concerned, again, I think that China has reached a degree of sophistication in its technology that probably protecting its technology is more important than exporting. So indeed, I think that China will more and more be interested and will make all efforts to join these regimes. Another remark, but then I'm finished, is that I don't think we can put Iran and Korea and North Korea in the same basket. They are two totally different situations. Iran is a member of the NPT. It has accepted some major curbs on its nuclear program. Therefore, I think we should discuss these two things, not in the same basket. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have a lady here in the front row. And then we'll go back to the panel and come back for a second round, okay?
Thank you for giving me the floor. My name is Wang Qi. I'm from Arms Control Department, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. Well, I have a comment on Mr. Stewart's intervention. Well, I'm very disappointed to hear that China is a single source of problem. Well, I believe that the non-proliferation work is a long process. No one is perfect. There's no end for non-proliferation. You could only improve yourself. There's no perfection for every country. You're right that China is a big producer of dual-use items. So I think it seems that there are more procurement activities happen in China, not because China didn't attach importance to the arms control and non-proliferation, but only because it's a big producer of dual-use items. Well, and also you mentioned that there are a lot of progress which has been made in recent years, and I will also add something on this. You mentioned that we are drafting a new export control law by MOFCOM, and at the same time, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is actually drafting a new law on non-proliferation. It's called National Non-Proliferation Law, because we are now developing a new concept which is called the whole process control, because the traditional control is that we attach great importance to the sector of export control. But now we look at the proliferation activity as a whole process, from its production, the research and development of the items, the transportation, the procurement, the export control, or even the final use of the items. So we look at it as a whole process and try to tackle the issue of proliferation to strengthen every control on the whole process. And also we have established we have established a new division in our department dealing with non-proliferation issues. It's called Non-Proliferation Division. And now we have a new facilitator who is a counselor who's dealing with non-proliferation issues as well. And when talking about the law enforcement, actually since 2004, we have established a inter-agency mechanism on non-proliferation and export control to deal with the possible violation of our laws and regulations. And now we are trying to enforce these mechanisms by seeking the possibility of establishing a mechanism at a local level to enhance the law enforcement in our nation. And also you mentioned the cooperation between China and the EU. This year not only marked the 40th anniversary of political relations between China and the EU, but only marks the 11th anniversary of the cooperation between China and EU on non-proliferation issues. So I think the basis of our cooperation is that we share the similar positions and the same goal on the issues of proliferation, and also we share the same responsibilities in this field. I think that's the fundamental basis for our cooperation, and also we also like to express our willingness to carry out our cooperation with EU on the basis of mutual respect, mutual trust, and equality. I know that you have appointed a new consortium to carry out the next phase of cooperation, and I'm very looking forward to the following cooperation between China and EU.
Thank you very much for your comments. And with this, I would like to go back to the panel in the reverse order in which you spoke initially. So if I may start with you, Bernt.
There was only one question regarding...
Can you push the mic, please?
Only one question regarding the nuclear-free zone. I think I have 2 points to make there. It's very difficult to assess what the North Koreans really want. I mean, if South Korea, Japan, and China make agreements, they will still look what the U.S. is doing. And their main concern in the past, when there were military exercises and there B-52 bombers involved, they always said, okay, there has never been a denuclearization on that side of the peninsula. There's a nuclear threat vis-a-vis North Korea, which is ongoing. Now, when you talk to them, okay, if military exercises are shifted somewhere else, and if there's a denuclearization, how far that has to go, and then there's no clear answer. Maybe the U.S. has to denuclearize first before DPRK feels secure. So it's something which is very difficult to resolve. The other thing is, of course, it's a nice initiative in the region, but to be honest, this kind of initiative, of course, would need some kind of transparency and verification. And I haven't seen in East Asia any kind of binding mechanism so far, so that would be quite novel if that would be achieved there.
Thank you.
So I think the only comment and follow-up that I will make is with regards to the source problem issue that I mentioned. On that subject, I'm very much driven by the data, if you see what I mean. So this data set that we've built at King's of all these cases flowing to Iran. Now, I mentioned that China is significant in that data set. What I would say, though, is whilst China as an individual country is the largest by far, if I was to group Europe together rather than grouping individual European countries, you'd find that Europe would be of almost a similar magnitude. And that speaks to me to this being a mutual problem. We all face this problem of illicit trade, diversion, and so on and so on. And this is why there needs to be cooperation. So I think Europe and China does have a lot of experience to share on that issue. Thank you for your remarks too.
Thank you very much, and Professor Hanhua.
Okay. I have 3 questions to answer. The first one is about territory dispute in the cooperation between China and his neighbors, right? To be frank, I didn't catch up your sense when you talk about the disputes, how the disputes influence the cooperation between China and his neighbor. Especially, you mentioned in the South China Sea, you talk about the Philippines to put that issue in the tribunal. International Court. That makes something, I mean, as a model to cooperate in the non-proliferation field.
No, I mean, can we have the microphone again, please, over there, please? I mean, it's either in the Maritime Tribunal or in the International Court of Justice.
Sorry.
Can you repeat the second, sort of the last part of the second question?
Yeah,
please?
so I probably wasn't clear enough because the tensions in the China Sea are between a number of countries, China, Japan, Philippines. The US is involved. It's like a protectorate of Japan. So therefore, the tensions there are increasing some of the tensions between two of the key powers, China and the United States, where cooperation is required for non-proliferation. This is where I was saying that some of those tensions are hurting the non-proliferation efforts. So the resolution of some of these conflicts could be very helpful to assisting the non-proliferation. The example I had given of one of the resolutions was that Norway and Russia had resolved their conflict over somewhat similar, the continental shelf, through the Law of the Sea Tribunal. And the question was whether these disputes might also be able to be dealt with in some of these tribunals, the Law of the Sea Tribunal and the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And that Philippines has already done that with regards to the lower islands, but that hasn't been raised as yet, I think, with some of the upper islands. And whether that might be like a good process to be able to help reduce tensions by exploring some of those issues in these courts where their expertise is territorial disputes. Thank you.
Okay, so the question is about the chances for the resolution of the South China Sea dispute through a multilateral legal mechanism.
Yes,
okay.
yeah.
And I think we will have also somebody from the audience who will want to comment
maybe,
on this.
He can help me because I'm not a maritime expert.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, because I believe maybe I'm...
sorry, could you maybe introduce yourself?
Hello.
I'm
Sean from China Mission here to the EU. Yeah, I'm based here, but I used to work in the Department of Treaty and Law in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so maybe I know much better about the South China Sea issue if you want to know about it, because actually it's a territory dispute issue rather than something related to non-proliferation. It has nothing to do with non-proliferation. Because just with we have such a question from the floor, maybe I can explain it a little bit here.
But if you could not go to the background, please, but just to the conclusion. I mean, is there the question?
Yes.
Is there a chance of resolving it through those tribunals?
Yes, it would be very brave, because China's position is well known to all the parties. That China won't accept and won't participate in this tribunal and in this arbitration case. We have a position paper on our website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. If you're interested in it, you can look for it. It illustrates clearly why China doesn't participate in it and why we don't accept on the arbitration, because in accordance with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, China made a declaration on the exclusion of the jurisdiction of such compulsory dispute settlement mechanism in the year of 2006. The second one, in accordance with international law, state consent is the basic principle for dispute settlement. China never accepts a third-party dispute settlement on sovereignty disputes, territory dispute issues.
Okay, thank you very much.
So it has nothing to do with it here. It's quite clearly, so thank you.
Thank you very much. It answers the question.
May I answer the CDBT one?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, ratification. I was at CIPRI when the treaty was negotiated in Geneva, so I followed the process quite closely. I feel the some debates inside China, and I feel it's also domestic, tension among different groups or different sections when they negotiate that treaty. And so maybe the dynamic is not the same as the U.S. In his domestic circumstances, but I feel like the signing of this CDBT is already show the Chinese sincere position in the disarmament, because as many American scholars already recognize the signing the CTBT is already a kind of a demonstration for Chinese to restrain his relative power, because the CTBT is a way to, how to say, put the ceiling of this nuclear capability, especially when China was not ready to do the computer simulation. Yeah. So at that point, I feel like China has already shown his. But talking about the ratification itself, I think still in the process of the Congress, People's Congress process. I not follow that news or the process so closely, but I can hear some resistance among the different participants during the Congress. So I feel the same, actually.
Well, thank you, but let me here reiterate also the European Union's very clear position in favor of the ratification of the CTBT, especially by the countries which are in the Annex 2 of the CTBT, the remaining 8 countries for which whose ratification is necessary for the entry into force also list. I mean, China is among those countries. So we are very much hoping that there will be progress in ratification, both in the U.S. and in China. And actually, the High Representative who spoke through video mentioned this in her remarks, and she is personally also a member of the group of eminent persons for the entry into force of the CTBT. And now, if we could have the microphone, please, in the front row for the next round of comments or questions, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, my name is Dr. Daryai. I'm a university professor.
Could you please speak up? Just speak louder, please, okay?
My name is it okay? Yeah. My name is Dr. Daryai. I'm the university professor in Iran. So first of all, I thank the panelists and appreciate for this discussion. I have some comments. Firstly, there is a contradiction in the title of this, as rightly mentioned by Ambassador. So you cannot compare Iran and North Korea. So I think that the situation is absolutely different, both from the legal undertaking that they have and also from the technical point, because North Korea did a nuclear test. And it's at a threshold nuclear weapon states. Secondly, I think what is important, and I think I got a message from those who have been involved in the negotiation, and the message of Madame Mogherini and Madame Schmidt was absolutely clear. And I think that's the JCPOA is a shift in the paradigm of tackling Iran. So I think those who are building up upon a business of Iranophobia, so by this JCPOA, that's the end of that business. So I think then we have to change our mind. And I really appreciate if colleagues read out very carefully the JCPOA and the commitment that has been accepted by Iran in that. It's very complex, it's very complicated. It brings Iran and also China and the EU 3+3 to this undertaking to implement the NSG, Nuclear Supplier Group list. So I think if we want to repeat the past decade allegations, some of them fabricated, some of them are not true. So I think that would not be really helpful. So if we want to I think, and I call it the JCPOA as a shift in paradigm. So we have to change our mind. We have to change our approach in dealing with the issue. And I'm sure that China and all countries, including Iran, will cooperate in the dispute resolution mechanism and also the Joint Commission for the issue of concern in the future. So I think that's absolutely alleviate any concern that might raise or might have been established during the past decade information or misinformation on Iran. So this is the comment that I really appreciate colleagues taking into account this issue, while I have some reservation on the comment made by one of your distinguished panelists, Mr. Stewart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think this is one of the clear conclusions from this panel. Microphone would be there. For this of this panel, that the two situations are actually very different, but the European Union's approach of looking for diplomatic, not military solutions to the issues, looking for multilateral solutions, is something which actually remains valid across geographic areas. We have a lady in the front row, I believe, or. Okay.
Thanks for your wonderful panels and discussions. I'm from University of Bradford, UK. My name is Myeon-her, originally from South Korea. And as a South Korean, peace researcher, I would say, I'm really eager to see what lesson we can learn from this Iranian nuclear talks. I know there are so many aspects that we can really compare directly between North Korean and Iranian situation, but still, I think there will be something to learn about this Iranian nuclear talks in terms of how the multilateral effort was working and how the United States shift in this stance and actually recognize the core interests of the Iran, having their nuclear programs. So if you can, especially Mr. Berger, since you're keen on this
Thank you very much for this question, and indeed the lady in the middle here, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for all the speech. My name is Muli. I am a PhD in law, currently affiliated in University College Dublin, and my research area is dual-use export control regime. So I can make some comments according to the Stewart speech and. Maybe help for Han to answer one question that gentleman has brought up. So first of all, that the social problems that Stewart, that you think China's current export control regime is like that way. So I think the problem is it's not because China has a ineffective export control system. Actually, non-proliferation export control contains three parts: the control list, the proscribed countries, the sensitive countries that the national law want to block from export, and the law and rules for effective control. Actually, I searched Chinese national law, and the third part, China has did very good job, especially for the criminal sanction part. But the problem is, if we search clearly for the control list, the control list is much more narrow than the EU's one and the US one. So that is probably the reason why we can see a case like the Stewart has just brought to us, the MKS Shanghai case, that even the U.S. dealers can use this loophole and transport their products through China to Iran. It's probably just because the narrow scope of control items, but not the whole export control system. So then it's brought to my second comments. So it's not very wise to block Chinese membership or ratification to those international non-proliferation groups, because it's just my own academic idea. So those non-proliferation groups, the most contribution is their control list. And as long as the people can join, country can join that groups, they will voluntarily comply with. But that means there is some burden for their national law to do more than they want to. But just because there's just no forum, I know that now China has joined the nuclear supply group, of course, but there's a lot of many other non-proliferation groups that China hasn't joined, doesn't have the chance to join. So that means that is exactly cop to the words that the EU has promoted. It's like a level play field. Currently, China just doesn't have a level play field to discuss with the other country whether the control list has represent any of Chinese foreign policy policy claim concern or against Chinese foreign policy concern. So that is the last comment. So for level play field, it's a very good attempt that if we can find any judicial remedies at international level that can at least provide a forum for China to discuss with the other countries, not on bilateral level, but multilateral level. And I have do research on that. UN and the WTO is probably they also have the dispute settlement system. But currently, the legislative part just doesn't allow any this kind of security-related unilateral national unilateral measures to be discussed.
Thank you very much for your explanations. If you could pass the microphone back to Ambassador Paul Berger of the Swedish Foreign Ministry. And let me just tell you that I don't think there was anything anti-Chinese in the lack of admissions. I mean, actually, we have some EU member states who are not being admitted, for example, to MTCR, and their applications have recently been rejected. So the dynamics is quite complicated. And we have Ambassador Paul Berger from the Swedish Foreign Ministry who has a comment or question.
Thank you very much. Jacek has already introduced me, so I don't have to do that. But I should perhaps say that I was Sweden's ambassador to the DPRK between 2001 and 2005. I asked for the microphone to actually endorse a point made by Mr. Berger. I was following the six-party talks when they started and for their most active years. And I have to say that I would give the six-party talks as a single-issue forum very little chance of success. However, I think there's much to be said for the point made by Mr. Berger that one should add further issues, including some that are of interest to the DPRK themselves, as a way of moving the talks forward. The idea of a nuclear-free zone was mentioned by another speaker. I don't think that that actually fits the bill, for the simple reason that the DPRK's nuclear program and nuclear policy has much more complex driving forces behind it. I don't think that a nuclear-free zone would really be high on the DPRK wish list. On the other hand, a peace treaty has traditionally been very important in terms of the DPRK's view of itself and its place in the world. So simply to endorse the idea that one should perhaps be looking at broadening the six-party talks by introducing elements that are perhaps of greater interest to the DPRK. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this thought. Indeed, when one encounters problems in negotiations, it is quite frequent that one tries to change the scope of negotiations, either narrowing down to an issue on which we can agree. I mean, if we cannot agree on everything what is on the table, let's at least agree on something, or conversely, broadening the scope of negotiations to bring in items which are of high value for one or the other side and might not be as valuable for the other side. So thanks for this insight. And we have here a gentleman on the left who I suspect is Iranian, judging by the attire.
Thank you very much. My name is Zahrani from Iran, heading an institute called IPIS. I will have to talk tomorrow also. But very briefly, different interpretation on nuclear deal between Iran and 3+3. But the most important question, why? I think to answer why, we have to compare 2003 with 2015. In 2003, Iran even accepted completely, just symbolic enrichment. But it was the West who did not accept it. So when we talk about West, I don't know whether we should put the blame on Europe or we should put the blame in the US. I will tell in a minute which one. The same people who were involved in Iran for that negotiation are not there, again, negotiating. So Iranian part has not really changed at all at that time and this time. Mentality and also decision makers, they are all the same. But today is a different case. I think Europe is also the same Europe as it was in 2003, 5+1. But what has changed, really, it is the decision makers in Washington. So I really do not think that much multilateralism is the real cause or real reason for this thing. It is the real a new mindset in Washington. At that time, we had a no conservative president, absolutely war talk and war language. And this time, you have somebody with a new mindset, talking with a new tone, and really a new paradigm. So I really want to emphasize about the role of individual in decision-making. When you talk about agent structure, it is agent which is really important. It was really Barack Obama who changed the situation. And really, we have to give him the credit. Iran is the same Iran. Iranian players are them. Europeans are the same. This change has happened. That's why we are here, I think. And
thank you for this important voice, for this important opinion. However, let me point out that the approach from the U.S. administration or U.S. individuals in 2003 was the unilateralist approach. And now there are more elements of a multilateralist approach in Washington. So there is a link here to be made. Do we have somebody else on this side of the room who would like to ask a question? Because we want to know. Front row, please.
Hi, my name is Francesca. I'm a PhD student from Nottingham. My question is for Mr. Stewart. He mentioned about China and the membership and India. I would like to ask you if you can say something more about the implication of China membership and Indian membership in multilateral regime and dynamics with Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. On this side of the room, I think we have Professor Harald Müller, one of the pillars of the consortium and this conference. So you certainly have the floor.
Thank you, Jacek. Harald Müller from Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt, with an out-of-the-box question to Ian Stewart. And the question concerns the future of the NSG. I think we have all to realize that the NSG is incrementally changing its character. It started as a club-like institution with a lot of like-mindedness, even though the Soviet Union was participating. And it's now a body of close to 50 members, most of which are, a majority of which is EU. China is in, Brazil is in, India is on the threshold. And I would predict that if things go right, 5 years from now, or at the latest 10 years from now, we would wish Iran to be a member too. And you know, the indicators are already in the agreement with the export control part of it. So it is clearly moving into something which contains more and more members because they are capable to influence the nuclear and dual-use market. And it is losing, of course, in this process, the specific advantages of a club. Namely, you know, the confidentiality, informality, like-mindedness. That's going step by step. At what point, I would like to ask you, as somebody who looks at export control issues very much in detail, at one point, would it make sense to move this whole thing towards a multilateral treaty, which is, of course, a dream of the non-aligned countries since many decades, which we always refused. But as we are moving in the direction anyway, it might offer advantages which so far have not existed. And if that would be a way to go, it would, of course, be significant, very significant for the European Union, who in the way would be in a leader position with the majority of the members. Thank you.
Your question is specifically about the NSG, converting NSG to a multilateral treaty, or all control regimes?
Well, I mean, I would like to start with the NSG because the process has progressed farthest in that direction. Okay. But of course, it would have implications for the Australia group and the MTCR as well.
Thank you. Let me just recall a Russian initiative from some years ago of a global control system. I think it was. This is how it was being promoted. But anyone else on this side of the room with a question? Back there, please.
Thank you. I'm Heinz Gärtner from Vienna. Because of the multilateral arms export control regime, of course, national export control mechanisms are important, but the litmus test is of whether you abide by a multilateral arrangement. And so my specific question to Professor Hua Huan, or one of officials of the Chinese officials here of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whether China in the foreseeable future considers to send an application to the Wassermann arrangement. The lists of the Wassermann arrangements are very much overlapping with the lists of the European Union. So if you don't want to become a member, so the question would be whether you at least would observe the lists of the Wassermann arrangement. And more importantly, even whether you could coordinate the regulation for the end-user licenses with those of the Wassermann arrangement, which could bring the idea to create a multilateral export control regime in the field of dual-use goods and conventional weapons a little bit closer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a question about China's attitudes towards the Wassenaar arrangement, which is a control mechanism for the conventional and dual-use items. And for this, I would give, for answering this specific question about China and Wassenaar arrangement, I'm giving the floor to the lady in the front row from the Chinese Foreign Ministry before going back to the panel for the last round of answers and comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you for giving me the floor again. China is not a member of the Wassenaar arrangement yet, but actually China has adopted part of the Wassenaar arrangement control lists, the control list of the weapon, but not the dual-use one. And also, I think since 2004, we have carried rounds of bilateral exchanges with the Wassenaar arrangement. So I believe maybe in the future it's possible that we could be a member of the Wassenaar arrangement.
Thank you very much for this clear answer. And now I would turn back to the panel for final comments and answers. And we have about not more than 10 minutes for them. So, Bernt, could you maybe start?
There was only one question.
Microphone.
One question. There was a very big question. Lessons learned from Iran for the Korean Peninsula. And I agree with all the speakers from Iran. The cases are just too different. I mean, there cannot be direct comparisons be made. But so I really have to think loud here. And one, of course, is the right timing. And I think if you look at it, North Korea, it's definitely not the right timing at the moment, because main problem of the North Korean regime that all of its policies are directed at regime survival, and I disagree that authoritarian regimes can make easy decisions. Usually they're very unconsolidated and they have internal power struggles, and it's very difficult for them to make clear decisions. And so, which brings me perhaps to a second point: how can we take this into account when we try to negotiate with a country like this? And in the past, we have always focused on these ideas of trust building and then opening countries up and engaging them. But I think in that case of the Korean Peninsula, it was perhaps South Korea who could not sustain this, because democratic governments change, have different policies, and South Korea, they try to have their imprint on history and policy making. The policies were changing, and the North Koreans just saw trust building coming and going, or the small steps, or the low-hanging fruits, or however it was called over time. Another point, besides the regime survival, I think we have to consider the key motivation of the negotiation partner. And then I think that is quite clear in North Korea, and it's what we agreed on, that single-issue negotiations on denuclearization with the North will not work, because they have a perhaps justified security dilemma in the North, which they try to deal with. And as long as they're not real security guarantees, which they only see in the peace treaty, and which, well, probably goes too far, but we need to really consider what kind of security building measures, not trust building measures, can be implemented, negotiated, that they can accept in order to move forward. And I think that's something we should consider, which is not a direct lesson from Iran, but maybe some way to the future.
Thank you very much. Maybe you have a couple of questions,
sure.
I believe. Yes.
Sure, I shall try to be quick and brief. With regards to the slight criticism of my view with regards to Iran, I'd like to address that directly. I support the JCPOA, and I did humbly what I could to inform the process of getting to that. What I would say is this: there's some degree of good faith built up now between Iran and the international community. That's good. We're in a good position. We've got 10 years now to implement perhaps the central part of the agreement. And the question really is, what happens with that good faith? Does it grow or recede? I see some positive signs and some not so positive signs. And let me be very frank in saying this. I think the missile tests of late are unhelpful. I think that's unfortunate, and I'm glad that there's been some Security Council discussion of that issue. And I think that's perhaps enough for now. I don't want to go beyond that at this point. With regards to illicit trade, Iran has engaged extensively in illicit trade over the last 10 years and more. And let's be very frank, it's wrong. It shouldn't have been doing so. I understand why it did, but it was a violation of Security Council sanctions resolutions and other things. I, myself, and many others will be monitoring illicit trade into the future, and I hope and expect that it will come to an end, both for nuclear purposes and I think importantly also for missile purposes. And if it doesn't, that good faith that I alluded to is going to erode, and then that will be, I think, a difficult issue for us to face. So I think that's an upbeat but pragmatic assessment, to be very frank. There were a couple of questions I'd like to group together on of China membership of the MTCR, on China, India, Pakistan membership of the regimes, on the idea of a treaty. I hate to promote my own work, but there was a paper that I released a couple of weeks ago through the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists called Export Controls at a Crossroads. I think we're at that point now, frankly, where we need to be thinking about the bigger scheme of things. Yes, I support having China in the MTCR. My sense between the different regimes is that there's little appetite in the Australia group for expansion in terms of new members and so on. We look at the Vastnara arrangement, which seems to me to be in a very difficult internal position right now, having Russia as a member, when its purpose is to prevent destabilising build-up of arms, and then we look at what's happening in Syria at present. So it seems to me that the export control regimes are kind of in a bit of a challenging position at present. I have funding to organise an event looking at the future of the regimes, and I very much hope that those who have commented on this issue will come forward to that. My own sense is that a treaty-based solution is perhaps not the right one. I instead look to the constituent parts of the export control regimes, the list maintenance process, which should be primarily a technical rather than a political task, the information sharing mechanism, which needs to extend much beyond the 50 states, but to, frankly, many, many more states, perhaps as many as are in PSI, perhaps even more than that. So then we can start to think about the role of PSI in this overall process, which I think is also conceptually challenged at present in terms of how it's functioning and what it's focusing on. There's an opportunity there in January with the mid-level dialogue on the future of PSI to consider that. Then the final one is 1540. 1540 I divide into two parts, the resolution and also the mechanism. The resolution, it seems to me, is well established now in the international community, and it continues come what may unless it's repealed. The mechanism, I think there are many conceptual and fundamental problems with how the 1540 committee and its group of experts are functioning at present. We have the comprehensive review of 1540 next year, and to inform that process, the committee will very soon release updated matrices for every country in the world, so we should be able to get a sense of how the resolution is being implemented and start to plan accordingly. I think the call for full implementation of 1540 by 2021, which was part of the President of the Security Council's address for the 10th anniversary, is an important one. And so when I think about this and how this all fits together, I think that at that point in 2021, we should be asking the question, can we in some way evolve 1540 to fit as part of this governance arrangement? If I may challenge our very kind and gracious hosts, though, so throughout this discussion, export controls has been a central part of the narrative. It's been raised by the presenters, by those in the audience. So the question I'd ask is, why isn't there more focus at this event on export control issues? My sense is that it's not the sexy issue that many want to focus on, but it's important. Hey, so I think we need to have more focus on this issue, and I'd make a plea for that. Thank you.
Very much, and actually my North Korean watch is showing that we are almost exactly on time. By way of explanation, actually the EU is organizing, I think, every year an export control conference. However, I think it is an EU-only conference, if I'm not mistaken, and we go into quite some detail into those issues. By way of a tentative conclusion from this panel, I think we all know that EU and China have cooperated very, very well on the resolution of the Iranian nuclear issue. However, it was a clear sense of this room that the case of North Korea and Iran are two very different cases. So only some general negotiating approaches can be implemented or brought from one to the other, like, for example, changing the scope, trying a different scope of negotiations and bringing more items on the table. Overall, I'd like to thank both the panelists and actually the other participants. I remembered during the panel that reportedly Confucius once said that every second person I meet on the road could be my teacher. So even Confucius could learn from half of the people he met. And I actually think almost half of the audience have spoken. So please join me in thanking not only the panelists, but also those from the audience who have contributed to our discussions. Thank you.